I assume that there's some familiarity with the events of what happened at the Electromotive, the Caterpillar subsidiary in London, Ontario. So I'll go over it rather superficially and integrate it with my comments. What I want to touch on is more about the nature of the resistance and the limitations of the recent strategic approaches to it. Because in the Caterpillar situation, we have an example of a gross attack by an employer on a group of union members. In this instance, demands for cutting their wages and benefits by half. But their goal was not to get a wage cut, but setting a workplace up for a closure. And in the process, seeking to humiliate and discredit and defeat the union and contribute to the defeat, which they saw, of a larger union movement. Now, the union's refusal to accept this through a campaign of local resistance based on terms traditionally successful, but in this instance, in this world, it really wasn't successful in the long run, but it was, in fact, a campaign of resistance. The kind of resistance embraced in this instance was unsatisfactory, and although the worst did not happen, the ultimate outcome of decent severance, pensions, and the like signaled both a serious defeat and an opportunity lost. There's little to celebrate out of this episode. It should be a sobering, partially disheartening, and should be a learning moment about what to do and what not to do, and what must be done to win in this era. In a union culture that's unable to deal with defeats and retreats, where everything you engage in has to come out smelling like a great victory, it makes quite a difficult time to learn the proper lessons. But we have to move on from that. The CAT resistance was important and positive in a number of ways, but ultimately was too limited. And that hurt the CAW and the rest of the labor movement and the Canadian working class, and it helped to reinforce an ongoing weakening of Canadian manufacturing capacities, and therefore our capacity to build a different kind of economy. It weakened the labor movement and helped the capitalist class and its political allies move forward in their efforts to deepen the neoliberal defeat of our class in this sort of reinvigoration of neoliberalism where we thought something else would happen. And finally, it's not limited to the CAW at all. It's part of a larger narrative of what's happening to the working class. Now, Electromotive is owned by Caterpillar. It's part of Progress Rail subsidiary, which was bought 18 months ago from two vulture funds, which had previously bought it from General Motors in 2005. In December, it issued this final offer to its London workers, I call it an offer, that would cut hourly wages to $16.50 from $35 an hour by slashing pension and benefits. Even though Caterpillar enjoyed record profits and a 20% boost to production over the previous year, there's disgusting things in a wonderful $18.7 billion pension plan issued to the president, who absconded with all of that stuff after all, but there's a lot of that stuff. I won't go into it now. The unit and local leadership, CAW Local 27, refused that demand, and the company locked out its workers on New Year's Day. The union local, with the support of the national union, began a campaign to isolate the employer and demand what they bargained seriously, withdraw the demands. The OFL organized a day of action for January 21st, drawing the attention to Harper and calling on domestic companies that something to be done, particularly around a discourse of companies that are domestic companies that are acquired by foreign multinationals. There was about 5,000 people there. Perhaps some people said 7, some people said 2,000. It was basically a series of speeches, and then people left. There was it was clearly on the radar on the labor and ordinary working people throughout North America, who saw this correctly as a kind of a private sector Wisconsin with all of the issues that entails. The interest was, in a sense, a kind of culmination in the frustration that so many working class people have had to live with in this era of this reconstitution of neoliberalism that has formed in the wake of the 2008 crisis. It touched the nerve of many people, including mainstream pundits who critiqued the larger phenomenon of blackmail against working people and saw in it the reality of all workplaces these days. Themes like the industrialization, the loss of manufacturing capacity, the use of law by large megacorporations and stealing patents in other capacities, and whether or not that really happened in this instance is still up in the air, and the loss of our capacity to influence things here. In the larger sense, it was part of a new and dangerously aggressive round of attacks on working class in the private and public sector, In the private sector, the employer effort to dramatically reduce compensation for workers in unionized and non-unionized plants. Plant closures in a shitload of areas, particularly around southern and southwestern Ontario. The site of key defeats in the past couple of years. Some, the result where unions simply gave up and accepted the logic of competitiveness. Some imposed by the state. And even where unions did mount a battle, there were serious defeats. I'm thinking of Valley Inco, and in particular the U.S. Steel battle in Hamilton. They were both key defeats, and you can't say that battles weren't waged. The losses in these situations were geared towards particular areas, such as wages, defined benefit pensions, and the attack on electromotive CAT imposed on workers took this to another level. And of course you have the public sector attacks. The terrain of the current attacks are different in many ways than previous rounds. They seem to be centered in employers that have been favored by governments, either through negotiated aid deals or forms of support, or part of continent-wide restructuring demands. Actually, what happened in February 3rd, after a month of campaigning, Electromotive announced the impending closure, and after a tense period, the union bargained a decent severance and closure package on February 21st. But I want to concentrate more on the nature of the resistance, what happened, what are the strengths and weaknesses, and I think in a few minutes I might be able to do that if I run through this quick. Both the national and local union leadership saw themselves as addressing primarily the needs of the workers in the electromotive unit, refusing to accept the cuts, but assessing that it looked like the place would be closed all along. They say that it was predicted earlier in the game, but the assessment was that Caterpillar would wait longer to make that announcement, but the resistance had some kind of effect on that. I think I'm pushing on this computer too much. There's a feeling that the pressure they organized in their local campaign forced Caterpillar to announce the closing sooner and gave them some leverage. The idea was to build a base of community and labor support in the London area, which they did, to get material support for some of those workers, to bargain a decent severance and pension agreement, which they evidently did. Many of their political themes were the right ones, but interestingly enough, after the previous presentation, they were always sort of articulated in the left populist discourse. They denounced corporate greed. They talk about the need to maintain manufacturing capacity, but it's never really a component which challenged the private ownership. Lots about inequality. A lot about American or foreign corporate takeovers of Canadian manufacturing workplaces that need to be addressed legislatively, tax on Harper, and a need to support from the rest of the union and labor movement. There were some positive tactics. There was a local campaign, behind the scenes pressure from the national office on the provincial government and on Caterpillar for pensions and severance, a blockade of movements of goods in and out of workplace, and the beginnings of pickets at CAT outlets. But there are problems, and I think the problems were the ones that were the main issue. There was no move to occupy and extend that campaign. Occupying that plant would have been a critical piece, and they purposely didn't want to do it. And their explanations were tied to their limited perspective. Things like, we didn't want to turn people off. They thought it would threaten pension benefits and severance later down the line. They saw that it would be impossible. It was even beyond the pale of even consideration. To pressure Harper to stop the closure or to take it over, in fact, never even considered it, to have the government take it over at all. They never considered an occupation, and they argued that the only reason you could have an occupation would be eventually to actually pressure severance if they couldn't negotiate severance. The idea of it as a political tool was something that was really difficult for them to see. And there was not very much, it's not as if it's that the national pressured the local to do this or vice versa. In fact, there was a general agreement among the leadership that this is really where they wanted to go. They did not want to occupy. They needed to, I want to flip this over and say why this was a problem. They needed to take dramatic action. As Joel said, you got to take risks now. I mean, you got to do certain things, and they need to occupy the place. And it's interesting, they adopted the discourse of the Occupy movement in terms of inequality, but when it came to actually doing some bold activities, it was enough for the young people to do it, but God forbid they should. The perspective was local, narrow, and very short term. There was no interest in making this a larger political battle that might have galvanized others across the province and elsewhere. Almost a blindness to the opening and opportunity that this university-condemned action by the company represented. It seems as if they were basking in a kind of sun of pity and defeat, and they were enjoying that. The idea of calling for state intervention and the idea of, in the form of nationalizing Caterpillar, was seen really as a pipe dream, behind the pale, as I said. And the idea that this might have placed challenging, in line with some of the things that Jim said, challenging our dependence upon private sector competitiveness as the way to build our economy was really beyond their ken. And it's partly, there's layers of this defeat, but it's also, it has to do with the populist discourse, not just what they say, but of how they think. The tactic of occupation was avoided because it was seen as possibly threatening, as I said, where they wanted to go. The idea of expanding the campaign in London to include challenging government offices, banks, large industrial employers, sort of the kind of thing they did during the days of action in London. A lot of these folks, the people who helped to organize that, was seen as some way that might, in fact, hurt some of the local allies. It's part of the way that they perceived a lot of their campaigns, in particular. Stephanie Ross has noted in some of her writing about how the Manufacturing Matters campaign in Windsor sort of had a lot of those kinds of sort of corporatist sort of elements. The idea of building a campaign across southern Ontario that might have included educational materials and challenges to other employers was not considered. One of the Toronto organizers of resistance to the public sector attacks asked me the other day at a demonstration, he asked me, he says, how many buses do they have? You know, do they really mobilize the same way that they mobilized, say, for the Days of Action, for the Quebec demonstration, or for the pension demonstration in Toronto? And the answer, of course, was no. The idea of boycotting cat products around the tar sands and construction projects also really wasn't done. And the idea of actually doing members with education with their members, who might have thought, well, this is going to turn people off, it might be too radical, was not done. And some of those, I must say personally, this used to be a General Motors plant. Well, I worked at a General Motors plant for 15 years, which closed in 1993. And a number of the people that I represented as a union representative actually moved to that plant, which was a General Motors plant. And when I was there for the demonstration in January, and they were, during the lockout, there were people gathered en masse at the gates. A lot of those people were people I used to represent. Some of those people were people I turned on to unionism almost over 30 years ago. And frankly, to see those people facing this was not great. I guess the real critical piece here is that a lot of people felt that this was the moment. This might have been a moment where actually we could have done something. I mean, we, the labor movement in general, and those of us who are constantly worried about the attacks on our jobs. People aren't raising questions like, why should we accept the constant threat to jobs in the name of cost reduction and competitiveness? Why should CEOs receive massive incomes when we have to accept wage and benefit cuts? Why must our children get used to the lack of good, secure, well-paying jobs? So I'm at the age when I have two grown kids who can't find jobs, you know? And accepting the normalization of part-time, low-paying, precarious work. These are the kinds of issues that all of us have on our minds. And this could have raised it. Everybody who was interested in what happened at CAT, who was pissed off, had these kind of questions in the back of their minds. It was a moment to raise a campaign. And that campaign wasn't there. Not to mention some of the political issues. I mentioned in terms of taking over this place, running it differently, nationalizing it. Demands to challenge free trade. The idea of hitting at Harper's growing vulnerability, at least among certain parts of the population, in terms of he was willing to intervene for the post office, willing to intervene for Air Canada. Why can't they intervene here? They intervene around the, accepted the intervention around the potash in Saskatchewan. What about our right to be able to produce things that we need? Here we are arguing in Toronto about building, building a mass transit. Well, what about, this is a locomotive plant. Why don't we take over a locomotive plant, run it as part of a critical resource for our country to actually build a mass transportation and freight industry? I mean, as if these things don't matter anymore. The articulation was mostly in terms of foreign takeover in the Investment Canada Act, which is important. It's done, and Jim Stanford, who spoke this morning, actually had some very good, important comments about arguing for industrial strategy about specializing in heavy construction equipment that Caterpillar made. And there are traditions. There are traditions that could have been built on here. I remember in 1997 there was a strike against General Motors that the CAW was forced to engage in. It was over the issue of job ownership. And interestingly enough, a lot of analogous elements were operating at the time. People were pissed off that auto workers make too much money, just like the kind of resentment that's happening today around public sector workers, or these workers who made $30, $35 an hour. Only some of them made $35 an hour, actually. Yet, when the CEW went on strike against General Motors in 1997, they raised the issue of job ownership. And what that meant was they actually struck a chord with the public. You might not remember this, most of you. And they raised the campaign, it was in Southern Ontario, saying that everybody is worried about losing their jobs because their employer is always looking for ways to cut and to replace your job with other jobs which pay less. And they said that auto workers are facing this, and we know that other people are facing this. And we're fighting for the right to stop General Motors from being able to do this, right, to us. You know, it was against outsourcing. But they posed it in a way that they said, we don't want it to happen to anybody. And they got a lot of public support for that strike, and they won it. Why couldn't they do something similar today? Why is it that it wasn't that long ago. Why is it that back then you can have that kind of imagination, but that imagination's gone? There were workplace occupations throughout the 1980s and 1990s in clumps, but they were mostly over severance, but they were there. And then there was the idea of why didn't they study the experience of what happened at Valley Income, where they had a local campaign against efforts to get rid of their pensions, to transform their pensions. Why didn't they study the campaign for Stelco? Here you had a politically led strike against attempts to gut pensions for new hires, and it was basically a lockout, and take away indexation for people who've been there a while. This is a very, very militant and educational campaign, but they weren't able to move out of their locality, and they didn't. Why weren't these things studied? Why did they bring those people in? Anyway, these are really critical problems, and they need to be looked at. I'm going to just finish by just going over a couple of summary points. The labor movement, even in its strongest, most militant spaces, is still reeling from previous political defeats. The economic offense of employers, the heritage of defensiveness, and at times the corporatist or concessionary tactical retreats. And corporatism is one of the critical ideological and practical components of where the CAW is at in terms of how it approaches private owners. Dependence on employers and low level of collective experience of political as well as industrial struggles that have characterized the most recent period of neoliberalism. In a seemingly never-ending series of responses to horrible attacks, they seem to repeat the same limited kind of pattern. At best, local campaigns to get support for jobs, investment, and livelihoods, no differentiation between the interests of the workers and particular employers, looking for sympathy and feel sorry for me and forms of solidarity, but never learning from mistakes from this strategy. Political demands remain limited. They don't challenge any of the rules of neoliberalism, and at best, they defend collective bargaining rights and protection against foreign corporate predators. And almost all of them take that form of it's some kind of foreign capitalists against our good guys. No effort to combine struggles with introducing ambitious political demands that put capital on the defensive and plug into the real concerns of millions of Canadians and Americans. They need to do a number of things. They need to take risks. They need audacious industrial actions which challenge the power of the employer and reinforce that challenge in the eye of other workers. Reliance on some of the more creative collective traditions of respective unions. Seizing the moment to create political campaigns that tap into almost universal revulsion with the attacks on living standards and jobs that come along with competitiveness and requirements of neoliberalism. Putting forward demands for manufacturing investment in jobs with a new and robust role of the state, including nationalization. Nationalization of certain manufacturing spaces, finance, and the creation of new capacities tied to industrial strategies linked to working people's needs, like transportation, healthcare, environmental transformation, a number of the things that previous speakers referred to. Demands that argue for a logic other than competitiveness and open up space for challenging our dependence on the private sector and accumulation in a crowded field, or worse, which is happening. Engaging members and working people in general on these themes, the idea of actually engaging people in the same way that Joel talked, that's how we built the Days of Action. People who voted for Harris were transformed into people who actually struck against employers for supporting Harris. That took work, that took transformation, that took education, but it was done. And some of the same people who are active today are close to the sunset of their careers, they did that work. Developing a different relationships between unions and community-based organizations and needs. For example, what kinds of links could have been built with the working class communities that are looking for jobs, that are right now tend to be wallowing in defending against cuts to social programs. If the union could actually, and the union movement itself, could have raised the issue about creating jobs in this sector for people. And finally, I think is probably, just will end this is that a reflective and self-critical renewal project, it's got to be really self-critical, and it's got to be reflective. You've got to look at these battles and say, we didn't win. Why didn't we win? What were the shortcomings of this? How do we move forward? And a critical component of that is what kind of politics do we practice? Because all of this sort of, it just literally begs for the question is that you need a different kind of politics. Thanks.